Welcome and thank you for joining me for this quiet journey into the past. In this story, we will take a long, gentle walk through medieval Europe. There will be no rush. We will move slowly, pausing often, noticing details, and lingering on the small things that made up ordinary life. Perhaps as you listen, you will feel your eyes grow heavy. Perhaps the slow rhythm of the words will carry you into sleep. That is perfectly fine. The past will still be here when you wake. At dawn, the forest lay in a hush so deep it seemed the trees themselves still dreamed. Pale light seeped between the trunks, silvering the mist that clung low to moss and fallen leaves. A narrow path wound there, barely more than a thread of trodden earth among roots and ferns. No cart had ever passed along it. It belonged to those who walked softly and trusted the green silence. The first traveler came early, a peasant woman with a basket looped over one arm. Her shoes were worn but dry, her shawl pulled close against the chill. Each step sank soundlessly into the mulch of many seasons. She paused often, listening, not in fear, but in that quiet way of one who lives close to woods and knows their speech. Above, a blackbird called sharp and sweet. Somewhere deeper in the shade, a deer cracked a twig and vanished before she turned her head. The air smelled of damp bark, cool earth, and the faint sweetness of resin where a pine had bled sap. Beads of dew clung to every spider's thread, jeweled strands strung between bramble tips. Mushrooms pushed pale caps through the leaf litter. Here and there a shaft of sunlight pierced the canopy, striking a mossy trunk to sudden gold. The woman stooped now and then to gather wild garlic, nettle tips, and a few small herbs she knew would soothe fevers or season broth. Each she placed gently in her basket, whispering a little prayer of thanks, for such was the way taught by mothers and grandmothers who had walked this same path. Her movements were slow and sure, leaving roots intact, tucking leaves to hide bare earth where she had picked. As the morning grew, the forest stirred to life. Squirrels scrambled across branches, scolding softly. A woodpecker's rhythmic tapping echoed like a distant drum. Two hares darted across the path and into ferns, white tails vanishing in a blink. Bees hummed where late blossoms still clung to bramble. The light shifted from gray to green gold as the sun climbed. Farther along the path widened slightly, lined with stones worn smooth by generations of feet. Travelers had long used this way to cross between hamlets, though seldom with haste. It was a path for quiet journeys. Woodcutters, shepherds, pilgrims heading to the shrine on the hill. Each left faint signs, an old boot print, a twig snapped to mark a turning, a length of cord knotted about a tree where someone once tethered a mule. A woodcutter appeared next, axe over his shoulder, singing under his breath. He nodded to the woman and passed, his breath making little clouds in the cool shade. Behind him came two boys driving a small donkey laden with empty panniers. They would gather fallen branches and pine cones for winter fires. Their chatter rose and fell, echoing strangely in the trees before fading again to the forest's hush. Midway along the path stood a great oak, its trunk gnarled and huge, hollow at the base. Folk called it the Story Oak, for many had rested there to share tales while traveling. Its bark bore carved initials and old marks, some weathered to near invisibility. The woman paused there, setting down their basket, and took a sip from the small gourd of cider she carried. For a moment she simply listened to the breeze sifting through branches, to the distant rush of a brook, to the faint creak of wood as the oak swayed. By noon the path warmed, patches of sunlight falling like gold coins through shifting leaves. The forest smelled richer now, sap warming, mushrooms ripening, distant smoke where some charcoal burner tended his mound unseen. Birds flitted low to drink from puddles. Dragonflies shimmered near a hidden stream. Somewhere a stag bellowed, deep and resonant, a sound that made the air itself seem to pause. Sometimes the forest path held secrets. A faint side trail might lead to a hunter's blind or to the ruins of an old shrine, its stones moss-covered and altar cracked. Today the woman glimpsed a tiny wooden cross fixed to a birch, perhaps in memory of someone lost or spared. She touched her fingers lightly to it and whispered a prayer before passing on. Toward mid-afternoon she met a pilgrim, dusty, hood drawn back, staff in hand. He greeted her softly and asked the way toward the next village. She pointed and wished him Godspeed. For a few steps they walked together, speaking of weather and road, then parted with small bows. In the woods such meetings were brief and courteous, bound by the shared respect of travelers who rely on each other's kindness. The deeper she went, the wilder the woods became. Trees stood closer, ferns brushed her skirts, the ground dipped and rose with hidden roots. No houses lay this far, only the occasional sign of past passage, a mossed-over hearthstone, a rotting fence, an apple tree gone feral and heavy with small tart fruit. She picked one, polished it on her sleeve, and bit. The taste was sharp and cool, a gift of forgotten hands. In a small clearing she stopped to rest. Sunlight pooled there, warm and dappled. A brook wound through, singing over stones, and dragonflies skimmed its surface. She sat on a fallen log, dipping her hands in the water to wash away leaf dust. The forest hummed around her. Bees, distant tapping of woodpecker, the sigh of wind high above. For a long moment, Tyne felt as slow as the moss creeping up the log beneath her. By late afternoon, the path began to climb toward the edge of the woods. The light grew softer, tinged with gold, and then rose as the sun sank lower. Birds grew quieter, save for the sudden caw of crows winging homeward. The woman's basket was nearly full now, herbs, nuts, a few apples, and mushrooms wrapped in leaves. Her step was tired but content. The day's gathering had gone well. At a bend, she paused to look back. The forest stretched behind her in rippling green shadow, mysterious and calm. Smoke curled faintly where the charcoal burner worked. A single shaft of light pierced the canopy to touch the great story oak far below. She felt a quiet gratitude for the wood's gifts, for its safety, for its ancient patience. Then she turned and went on. Soon the trees thinned, and the sound of distant bells floated faintly vespers from the village church. Fields opened, winter stubble silvered by the setting sun. She stepped from shadow to light, the last leaves brushing her shoulders. Behind, the forest kept its secrets. Before, the small world of hearth and cottage waited. The forest path would still be there tomorrow and the day after, watching with old green eyes. It asked only that one walk gently, take what is needed, and leave more than footprints behind. In its shade, time seemed to slow, and the burdens of life grew quieter, carried away on the breath of moss and leaves. Before the first light touched the thatched roofs of the village, a single door opened with the soft squeal of wood on worn hinges. Out stepped a woman wrapped in a dark wool cloak, basket on her arm, staff in her hand. She paused to breathe the cool air, full of night's damp and the faint sweetness of dew. The stars were paling. A thrush sang somewhere in the hedgerow. Today she would walk far, for the time was right to gather the healing herbs that kept her craft alive through the long year. Her cottage stood at the edge of the fields where barley swayed in summer and sheep grazed after harvest. She was known simply as Agnes the Gatherer. Neither midwife nor full physician, she was something older and quieter, one who knew the names of plants and their seasons, the humors they eased, the way to coax medicine from root and leaf. People came to her with fevers, aches, and small wounds. Mothers sought her when infants colicked, shepherds when sheep grew lame. She walked first along the village lane, boots brushing through wet grass. The cottages were still dark, save for one or two where early bakers tended coals. A sleepy boy driving cows to pasture lifted a hand in greeting. Beyond the last fence, the track turned to rutted earth, bordered by hawthorn and elder heavy with dew. Here Agnes began to look more closely, eyes sweeping for early herbs that liked the field's edge. At the first bend she knelt to gather plantain broad green leaves good for stings and cuts. She plucked with care, leaving the heart of each plant so it might grow again. Into her basket went yarrow too, its feathery stalks strong against bleeding. She murmured the small words her grandmother had taught. Must spells, but thanks, a way to honor the taking. Mist curled low about her boots, and a skylark rose sudden and bright into the gray sky. By mid-morning she had crossed into meadowland. Bees hummed over late clover, grasshoppers clicked unseen. Here she sought Bethany and lady's mantle, time and self-heal. She cut each plant with a small knife, careful not to muddy the roots, and laid them neatly in her basket, wrapped in linen so their oils would keep. Now and then she chewed a sprig of mint to freshen her mouth and ward off weariness. Other travelers passed, a shepherd whistling to his dog, a carter rattling toward the next village. All knew Agnes by sight and gave her nods of respect. Some slowed to ask if she might visit later for an aching joint or a cough. She promised gently and walked on. Her trade was not wealth, but trust. She listened more than she spoke, and her herbs did quiet work where priests and surgeons might not reach. At the edge of the forest she paused. Tall beeches arched overhead, their trunks pale as bone in the soft light. Here grew the deeper medicines, foxglove for the heart, though dangerous if misused, comfrey for broken bones, elderflower high in the hedges for colds and fever. Agnes entered slowly, senses sharpened by long practice. The forest held peace, but also demanded respect. She followed a deer track until she found a small clearing where damp soil fostered valerian. Its pale blooms nodded as she cut the roots, their scent sharp and sweet. She tied them in bundles and hung them from her staff to dry as she walked. Farther in, she sought angelica by a stream and wood sorrel in the shaded moss. Each plant seemed to know her gentle hands. She never stripped a place bare, always leaving enough to seed and grow. Near noon she rested by the brook, spreading her gathered herbs to air. She ate a simple meal, bread, a wedge of cheese, an apple from her tree. Water, cool and clear, she scooped with her palm. Birds flitted close, unafraid. A wren perched nearby and sang. For a time she simply sat, feeling the weight of the earth and the quiet rhythm of seasons that had taught her more than any book. On her return she took a different way, stopping at known spots, a patch of tansy near a ruined wall, mugwort by an old boundary stone, violets in a damp hollow. The day warmed, light dappled through leaves, insects droned in lazy circles. Her basket grew fragrant and heavy, green and gold and purple with summer's bounty. As she neared the village, smoke curled from chimneys. Children ran to meet her, curious about what she had found. She showed them safe things, mint to chew, lavender to tuck under pillows while keeping the stronger roots out of reach. They trailed after her like small birds, chattering. At her door she shooed them kindly away and stepped into the cool dimness of her cottage. Inside, bundles of drying herbs already hung from the rafters. Rosemary, sage, thyme. Clay jars lined the shelves, each labeled in neat hand. Mortars waited on the table, pestles smooth with years of use. Agnes laid out the new plants, shaking loose any soil, and began to tie them for drying or set roots to steep in wine and vinegar, the room filled with a sharp, sweet, earthy fragrance. In the afternoon she worked steadily, grinding powders, simmering ointments, straining tinctures. A knock might come, a mother with a fevered child, a shepherd seeking balm for cracked hands. She would pause, listen, offer what she could. Payment was small, an egg, a loaf, a promise to mend her fence. She asked little. The woods gave enough. By twilight the work was done. Herbs hung neat in rows, jars sealed, salve cooling in shallow pots. Agnes washed her hands in the basin, scrubbing green stains from her palms, and stepped outside to watch the sky fade from gold to violet. The fields lay quiet, smoke curled from every chimney, the church bell tolled softly for evening prayer. She thought of the day's path, the damp meadows, the whispering woods, the brook where she had rested. Each plant had its season and its song. She had listened and gathered and given thanks. Tomorrow might bring rain or visitors in need, but tonight was for quiet rest, the scent of drying herbs, and the small satisfaction of work well done. Above her, the first stars showed. She smiled softly, lifted her basket, now empty, but fragrant, and carried it inside. The door closed with a gentle thud, and the little cottage at the edge of the fields settled into silence, warm with the promise of healing stored for the long winter ahead. At first light, the moor lay wide and pale beneath a sky streaked with silver cloud. Low mists curled along the hollows, hiding streams and stones until the sun rose high enough to burn them away. The land rolled out in gentle swells of heather and coarse grass, dotted here and there with granite boulders like sleeping beasts. It was lonely ground, but not empty. A single figure walked its pathless reaches, the shepherd, staff in hand, dogs trotting close, flock moving in a soft grey tide behind. His name was seldom spoken beyond the small village on the edge of the upland. Folk called him simply Will the shepherd. He lived in a turf-roofed hut, half sunk into the hillside, stone-walled and smoke-dark within, with a pen for lambing and a low byre for shelter. Each spring, he drove his sheep upward to the summer grazing. Each autumn, he brought them down fat with grass. Between those times, the moor was his home. Morning began with small tasks. Will stirred the fire from its bed of ash and set a pot of porridge to warm. The dogs, lean, clever-eyed creatures, stretched and shook off sleep. Outside, the flock already stirred, bells tinkling softly as ewes nuzzled lambs. Will ate, pulled on boots and a heavy cloak, and stepped into the cool, damp air. The dogs leapt ahead, eager for work. The moor was quiet but never still. Wind whispered through heather, larks spiraled upward with tumbling song. Small rivulets gurgled unseen among reeds. Far off, a curlew called its eerie note. Will listened without thinking, his ears long trained to read these sounds as easily as others read ink. A sudden hush might mean a fox. A distant bleat told of a stray lamb. The rush of wings could warn of hawks. He moved the flock slowly, staff tapping now and then to guide or call. The dogs worked almost without words, sweeping wide to keep the sheep together, crouching low, eyes fixed on the animal's shifting line. It was a silent dance, learned over seasons of work. Man, dog, and sheep, bound by instinct and long familiarity. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed, scattering mist and lighting the moor in hues of gold and purple. Will paused on a rise to watch the land. To the east lay the faint line of forest. To the west, the distant shimmer of sea. Between stretched miles of open moor, empty to an untrained eye, but full of small lives, hares darting, bees humming, skylarks wheeling high. He felt the deep peace of it settle in his chest, as it did most days. Sometimes he met no one for days. Other times he would glimpse a lone rider on a distant track or a charcoal burner gathering wood in a hollow. Once in a while another shepherd appeared, and they shared a meal, news of weather and wolves, the price of wool. Words were few but welcome. Then each returned to his wide, separate watch. Near noon he brought the flock to a sheltered dip where grass grew thick and a spring bubbled cold and sweet. While the sheep grazed, Will sat on a flat stone, mending a leather halter or carving a new crook for his staff. The dogs dozed in the sun. His meal was simple, coarse bread, a slice of cheese, an apple. Above him clouds drifted slow and grand, like ships on a quiet sea. Weather ruled his life. He read it in the curl of smoke, the flight of swallows, the smell of rain on heather. When storms threatened, he drove the flock to safer ground, dogs circling tirelessly. Lightning storms were worst. The moor lit sudden and wild, thunder rolling like a drum. Then he huddled with his sheep in low ground, cloak over his head, dogs pressed close. When it passed, he counted his flock by lantern light, murmuring to calm them as much as himself. Summer days were long and gentle. Heather bloomed purple, bees thrummed, and lambs grew sleek and strong. Will sheared when the weather turned fair, hands quick with shears, though the work was slow and tiring. He washed the fleece in streams, drying it on rocks under the sun. Some he would sell, some he kept for winter cloaks and bedding. Autumn brought change. Winds sharpened. Geese called overhead. Mornings grew edged with frost. Will watched the flock carefully then, guarding against chill and hunger. He cut peat for his hearth and stacked it to dry. He gathered herbs from sheltered hollows for the rare illnesses that struck sheep or man. Days shortened, and nights on the moor grew long and star-pricked. At night his hut glowed faintly, a small island of warmth in a sea of dark. Inside the air smelled of wool and smoke. He ate stew simmered all day over low peat fire, then mended harness or sharpened knives. The dog slept at his feet. Sometimes he carved small figures from wood, gifts for the children of the village when he went down for market day. Other nights he simply listened to the wind singing over the heather and let sleep come slowly. The stars over the moor were a wonder. With no hearth smoke to dim them, they blazed bright and close, turning the sky to silver fire. Will often stepped outside to gaze upward, staff in hand, feeling small but safe beneath that vast sweep. He knew their patterns, the wane and the hunter, the pale wandering lights of planets. They were old companions, steady as the seasons. Once or twice each winter, wolves came thin and hungry. Then the dogs barked fierce and loud, and Will rose from his bed to drive them off with torch and stone. Fear sharpened him, but he stood firm. The flock was his charge. When danger passed, he stroked the dog's ears and whispered thanks. The sheep pressed close, warm and trembling, then settled again to chew cud as though nothing had happened. The moor taught patience. Days could be long and lonely, but there was deep rhythm in its quiet. Will knew each hollow, each rock, each favored grazing patch. He knew where wild thyme grew sweet and where the first snow lingered. He measured time not by clocks, but by sun, stars, and lambing cries. Market days were his brief taste of Busses. He drove the flock down to the village, wool packed for trade. There he met neighbors, shared ale, heard news of wars and kings far away. Children clung to his cloak, eager for carved toys. He bought salt, needles, and the few things the moor could God give. By evening he was glad to turn back to his quiet hills. When spring returned, lambs were born in soft bleating chorus. Will knelt to help the weak ones, wrapping them in his cloak, rubbing life into damp, trembling bodies. The dogs watched, alert and tender. Each new lamb was a small victory against winter's hunger, a promise that the flock and the shepherd would endure. So passed his years, slow, solitary, full of work but also peace. Storms came and went, wolves prowled and vanished, lambs grew and were shorn, seasons turned. The moor held him in its vast, quiet arms, asking little beyond care and patience. In that wide silence he found a kind of contentment few in busy towns could imagine. And though travelers might call it lonely, the shepherd did not. The wind was his companion, the dogs his faithful friends, the stars his roof. Each dawn brought a new sky, each dusk a hearth of his own make. In a world of lords and wars, his life was small, but it was steady and enough. The marsh lay low, and still beneath the fading light, its waters glassy and dark, its reeds whispering in the soft evening breeze. From afar it seemed only a flat, endless stretch of green and brown, but to one who stepped carefully among its paths, it was a world alive with quiet voices. Twilight was its hour, when the day's heat gave way to coolness, and the creatures of water and shadow began to stir. A narrow boardwalk of old timbers led inward from the drier ground. It creaked faintly underfoot, worn smooth by years of shepherds, fishermen, and herb gatherers. On either side, the reeds stood tall as men, their feathery heads bending with each breath of wind. Water pooled black beneath them, broken here and there by the gleam of a raren's eye or the ripple of a fish turning below. The air smelled of damp earth, moss, and the faint, sharp tang of peat. Insects hummed and hovered, their wings catching the last shafts of sunlight. Frogs croaked low and steady, a chorus that rose and fell as though the marsh itself breathed. Somewhere out of sight, a bittern boomed, its call deep and hollow, rolling across the flat land like a hidden drum. A fisherman moved slowly along the path, nets slung over one shoulder. His boots were caked in mud, his hands calloused and stained with the day's work. He stopped often, scanning the water's surface for movement, listening with half an ear to the cries of the birds. At twilight, the fish rose near the surface. He would set his nets before darkness fully fell, then return by lantern light to check his catch. Closer to the reed beds, a herb woman bent low, gathering rushes for candles and plants for her jars, water mint, marsh marigold, and sedge. She worked quietly, wrapping her harvest in linen, whispering words of thanks to the still water. She knew where to step, where fur earth lay hidden beneath the bog, where danger lurked in unseen depths. The marsh creatures stirred as the sky deepened to rose and violet. Ducks wheeled overhead, calling as they settled into the pools. Small insects swarmed in dancing clouds, and swallows darted through them, swift and sure. In the shallows, a family of geese paddled homeward, their wake spreading in gentle ripples that shivered against the reeds. As the sun sank lower, the colors of the marsh shifted. Water reflected the fire of the western sky, crimson and gold mirrored in broken patches. The reeds turned dark, their tips glowing for a breath before fading to shadow. Mist began to creep upward, thin tendrils curling along the water's edge. The land grew hushed, as if holding its breath before night. From the village at the edge of the marsh came faint sounds, a bell calling folk to evening prayer, the distant bark of a dog, the clatter of a pail at a well. Yet here those sounds were muffled, softened by distance and damp air. The marsh had its own voice now, soft lap of water, the croak of frogs, the sigh of wind weaving through reeds. The fisherman set his net, poles driven deep into mud, ropes tied with practiced hands. He worked steadily, the last light glinting on water and steel. Then he straightened, wiped his brow, and lit a small lantern. Its glow was warm and small, a star amid mist. He walked slowly back back toward the path, leaving the nets to their silent work beneath the darkening surface. The herb woman turned for home as well, her basket heavy, her shawl damp with mist. She stepped lightly along the boards, her lantern swinging, the reeds parting before her like a green curtain. Now and then she paused to listen, making sure the marsh was quiet, for sometimes strange sounds carried at twilight, cries half like men's, half like beasts, born of echo and water. Full twilight fell, and the marsh seemed to expand in darkness. Pools gleamed faint, like mirrors of the last sky fire. Reeds swayed black against a dim horizon. Stars pricked the sky one by one, reflected double in every still pool. The air grew cooler, scented now with damp moss and peat smoke drifting faintly from village hearths. By night, the marsh belonged to other keepers. Owls drifted low, wings soundless as they hunted. Foxes prowled the edges, their eyes flashing green in lantern light. The bitterns' call sounded again, deep and lonely, carrying across the mist. In the still water, fish moved silently into nets, unseen beneath the mirrored sky. When the fisherman returned with his lantern, he worked slowly, pulling nets from water heavy with catch. The fish shone silver in the flickering light, scales gleaming wet. He murmured a short prayer, thanking the marsh for its gift, then slung his net over his shoulder and turned for home. His boots splashed quietly in the shallows, echoing in the reeds. The herb woman, too, made her way out, basket hugged close, lantern leading her step. Together, though at distance, they walked back to the village, two small lights moving through the vast dark. Behind them, the marsh settled once more, its voices fading into the hush of night. By the time they reached the first cottages, the bell had ceased, the hearths glowed, and the village lay drowsy. They slipped into the narrow lanes, the marsh mist trailing faintly after them like a secret cloak. Behind, the wide expanse of reeds and water returned to silence, holding its mysteries beneath stars and fog until dawn. As day began to sink, the marsh woke in its own secret way. The sun, low and red gold, turned every pool to copper and every reed to black lace. Mist rose in long, slow curls from the wet earth, clinging to willows that leaned crooked over the water. The air smelled of damp mud, moss, and the faint sweetness of flowering sedge. It was a place that belonged more to herons and frogs than to men, yet some paths wound through for those who dared or needed its quiet ways. A single man walked one such path this evening, a fisherman named Tom, known in the nearby hamlet for his eel traps and knowledge of watery places. His boots, well greased against wet, sank slightly at each step, make soft sucking sounds. Over one shoulder he carried a willow creel, in his hand a lantern unlit for now. His dog, a small shaggy creature, padded at his heels, ears twitching. The marsh was never truly silent. Even now, with the day fading, there came the hum of gnats, the plop of unseen fish, the whisper and sigh of reeds rubbing together. Frogs croaked lazily. Once, far off, a bittern boomed its hollow call. Birds rose in slow flurries, wing beats heavy with evening. Every sound was softened by mist and water, until the whole world felt hushed but alive. Tom moved slowly, as one must on marsh paths. Planks and stepping stones marked the way, but some had shifted with floods. Other spots required careful probing with his staff. He knew these ways well, yet still he tested each step, for the marsh punishes haste. Now and then he paused to study ripples or the faint flash of silver where a fish turned. He was not hunting tonight, or checking traps he had set the evening before. Eel traps woven from willow waited in hidden channels. Wooden weirs guided fish into baskets. Some were empty, others heavy with their silent catch. Each he lifted, emptied into his creel, and reset with patient skill. The work was quiet, broken only by the drip of water and the gentle slap of fishtails. As twilight deepened, the marsh changed its color. Greens and browns turned to silver and black. Pools mirrored the bruised sky. Lantern light flickered far off where another fisher tended nets. Tom lit his own lantern at last, shielding the flame with his cloak until it burned steady. Its glow made a small golden island in the encroaching dark. Creatures stirred in the gloom. A heron rose ghost-like, long legs trailing. Mice rustled in the sedge. Once Tom glimpsed the quick mask of an otter slipping into a pool with barely a ripple. The marsh was shy but not hostile. It allowed him passage so long as he moved with respect. He murmured small words now and then, not spells, or the old habit of greeting wild places as friends. Passing a stand of alders, he came upon an ancient stone causeway half lost to moss. Long ago it had been a pilgrim road to some forgotten shrine. Only fragments remained, stones sinking unevenly into the mud. Tom crossed with care, lantern swinging, imagining feet from centuries past, treading the same path. Monks in brown robes, weary travelers seeking safe passage, perhaps even soldiers long gone. On the far side, the ground rose a little, forming a low island where dry grass grew. Here Tom often rested. Tonight he sat on a fallen willow trunk, setting his lantern on a knot of roots. The marsh spread before him, silver in moonrise, mist curling like breath. He ate a bit of bread and cheese, shared a scrap with his dog, and listened. The vast hush was broken only by water's slow gurgle and distant bird cries. As darkness deepened, stars pricked through the haze, mirrored in the still pools. Fireflies blinked green gold among the reeds. Somewhere, far off, a bell from the village church tolled the hour. It sounded strange and softened, as if the marsh itself were swallowing the sound. Tom felt the quiet sink deep into him, steady and calming after long days of labor. Soon he rose, shouldering his creel, heavier now with the night's gathering. His lantern cast narrow paths of light ahead, catching spider webs in the eyes of small watching creatures. The dog trotted close, silent but alert. Step by careful step, they followed the winding boards and stones back toward firmer ground. On the edge of the marsh, the first dry fields began, and with them the faint smell of hearth smoke. Lights from cottages shone like stars at ground level, warm and homely. Tom paused and looked back once. The marsh lay behind him, vast and mysterious, breathing mist under the moon. It would be there tomorrow and the next day, unchanged, keeper of quiet secrets. He turned and went on, boots finding surer ground. Before long he would gut and salt the fish, bank his hearth, and sleep well to the soft lap of water still echoing in memory. The marsh had given its gifts, and he had passed through its twilight untroubled, leaving only ripples and the faint glow of his passing lantern to fade behind him. Beyond the last ploughed fields, where hedges gave way to thicket, there lay a forgotten orchard. Its trees stood crooked and wide, their bark furred with moss, their branches tangled. No plough had touched the soil in many years, yet each autumn the orchard burst into quiet bounty, as though memory itself still fed the roots. Children sometimes whispered of ghosts there, for old stones marked the place where a farm had once stood. But to those who walked gently, the orchard was only peace. One late afternoon, a young villager named Alice carried a basket along the narrow path. The sun hung low, staining the sky amber. Gnats danced in slanting beams of light. She ducked beneath hazel boughs and pushed through bramble until the trees opened before her. The orchard welcomed her with a hush broken only by the rusters of leaves and the faint thud of fruit dropping in the grass. Apples lay scattered everywhere, some bruised and half-eaten by birds, others shining and whole. Pear trees leaned heavy with golden fruit, their scent rich and sweet. A few plum trees clung on, dark clusters hidden among wild tangles. The ground was thick with nettle and dock, yet paths worn by deer wound between trunks. Alice paused, breathing deeply, the air full of earth, fruit, and late sun. She knelt to gather carefully. Each apple was polished on her sleeve before it joined the growing pile in her basket. Some she tasted, sharp and tart, others were sweet as honey. She chose both, for tart apples kept better through winter, while sweet ones filled pies and cider presses. Birds wheeled above, cawing at her intrusion, though she smiled at them as old friends. At the far side of the orchard stood the crumbled stones of the farmhouse. Only a hearth remained upright, choked with ivy. Once, families had warmed themselves there, cider simmering in kettles, children's laughter echoing through rafters. Now silence reigned, yet the orchard's trees bore faithful witness, still offering fruit though no hands had pruned them in many winters. Alice touched the stone gently, as if greeting a long-lost elder. She sat a while beneath a pear tree, lantern at her side, though the dusk had not yet deepened. She ate bread and cheese, then a plum, its juice staining her fingers. Her dog nosed through the fallen fruit, tail wagging. The orchard was wild but not unfriendly, and she felt as though time slowed in its shade. Bees droned, wasps hummed, and the air thickened with the hum of life. As twilight came, colors deepened. Leaves turned to black lace against a rose sky. The air cooled, smelling of damp earth. Mists crept from the low meadows beyond. Owls began their soft, ghostly calls. Alice gathered the last apples into her basket, heavy now, and tied her cloak tighter. Still she lingered, watching the orchard surrender to night. In the dimness she fancied she saw shapes among the trees, perhaps deer nosing fallen fruit, perhaps only shadows. Once she thought she heard a child's laugh carried on the wind, but it was likely only the call of a fox. The orchard kept its secrets. She rose at last, lifting her basket, and began the path home. Lantern light flickered golden as she walked. Behind her the orchard darkened fully, trees bending like ancient guardians. By dawn it would be heavy with dew again, fruit falling in the silence of early light. And though people might forget the farmhouse stones, the orchard would remember, season by season, bearing witness in apples and pears until roots turned to dust. Alice reached the first hedge, pausing to look back once. She whispered a word of thanks, small and sincere, to the unseen keepers of the orchard. Then she turned toward the village, basket heavy but heart light, carrying a piece of the wild harvest back into human hearth and home. High on the wooded hillside, where the path narrowed to a track no cart could follow, a small cave opened in the rock. Moss softened its edges, ivy draped across like a curtain. Smoke curled faintly from a hole in the roof, caught and pulled thin by the breeze. This was the dwelling of the hermit, a man who had turned from village and market to live alone with the silence of God and the company of the wild. His name was Brother Stephen, though few called him so now. Once he had been a monk in the great abbey below, copying psalms and tending bees. But after years of quiet longing, he had asked leave to live apart. The abbot, seeing both wisdom and weariness in his eyes, granted it. So Stephen had come to this cave with little more than a cloak, a staff, and a handful of tools, and had stayed for many seasons. Morning began early. The cave faced east, and dawn light slid in soft and gold across the rough floor. Stephen woke on his straw bed, wrapped in a woolen blanket, and stirred the embers of last night's fire until they glowed. He brewed a thin porridge and a cup of herb tea, eating slowly as he listened to birds greeting the sun. His prayers were whispered, unhurried, rising with the smoke. Afterward, he tended his small garden beds of leeks, onions, and herbs held by low stone walls. Beyond grew a few apple trees he had grafted years ago. He weeded, watered from the nearby spring, and checked traps set for rabbits or snares for fish in the stream. His life was spare but not joyless. Each task done well felt like a prayer in itself. Sometimes he carved bits of fallen oak, became simple crosses or small bowls. Smooth stones turned into beads. These he traded twice a month when he walked down to the village. In return, he took flour, oil, and salt. The villagers met him with quiet respect. Some asked for blessings, some left food at the edge of his path rather than speak. They knew his presence brought a strange peace, though they did not always understand it. The woods around his cave were alive in subtle ways. Deer moved like shadows through dawn mist, foxes slipped silent over leaves, owls slept hidden in branches. Stephen learned their trails and voices until they felt like neighbors. Sometimes a bird would perch unafraid near his hand as he dug or prayed. He never hunted more than he needed, never took without thanks. Midday was for reading. In his cave, carefully wrapped in linen, he kept a few books, a psalter, a gospel, and an old herbal. Their pages, though worn, were loved. He read slowly, lips moving, savoring each word. Then he sat in stillness, letting thought and prayer mingle with the quiet breath of the forest. Storm days were different. Rain drummed on the rock above. Wind moaned through the trees. The cave grew dim and smoky, but Stephen felt safe within its stone embrace. He would tend the fire, mend clothes, and listen to the storm's voice. On such days he thought of the Abbey's warm halls and knew he did not regret leaving. His place was here, alone yet held by the greater silence. Sometimes travelers came seeking him, lost hunters, weary pilgrims, or those troubled in spirit climbed the hill to his door. Stephen welcomed them with tea and bread, offered a place to rest, and listened. He gave little advice, preferring questions to answers, but people left lighter, as if the quiet itself had spoken to them. On feast days he walked down to the abbey to join the monks in prayer. They greeted him as brother still, though he lived apart. He knelt with them, sang the old chants, and returned before night to his cave, the music lingering in the trees as he climbed. Winter tested him. Snow sometimes blocked the path. Wood had to be cut and stacked before frost came. Nights grew long and bitingly cold, yet the cave held warmth from the banked fire and thick firs. He sat in flickering light, carving or praying, while outside the forest slept under stars. Wolves howled far off, but the dogs of the nearby farms and Hermit's own small fire kept them away. Yet winter also brought a deep, strange beauty. Icicles hung like glass from the cave mouth. Deer came closer, pawing for food under snow. The sky on clear nights blazed with stars so sharp it seemed one could fall into them. Stephen, wrapped in furs, would stand outside and whisper prayers to the silent heavens. Spring came softly. Snowmelt trickled down to the stream. Violets bloomed in damp hollows. Stephen planted new herbs, pruned the apple trees, and gave thanks for another turning of the year. Birds built nests near his roof. Bees hummed from the hollow log where he kept a small hive. Life renewed itself without fuss. Years passed like this, quiet but rich. He aged gently, hair silvering, hands growing lean and lined. The forest became more a home than any stone hall. He spoke less to people, more to God. Yet when villagers climbed to ask blessing or herbs, he welcomed them with the same soft kindness. In his solitude he felt not loneliness, but deep belonging. Sometimes at dusk he lit a small lamp and set it just outside the cave. Its glow was faint but steady, a sign for wanderers that safety and warmth were near. A few shepherd boys, lost in fog, found their way by it once. A merchant delayed by storm warmed there another night. Such acts pleased Stephen quietly. No sermon could say as much as a single flame in darkness. And so the hermit's cave became part of the hill's story. Travelers spoke of it, villagers took comfort from its unseen prayers. Season by season, the man within grew older, but his life remained as simple and strong as the rocks that sheltered him. In a world full of turmoil, his small, faithful silence stood like a lantern against the dark. Deep in the forest, far beyond the last ploughed fields and the thin smoke of hamlets, stood a small log cabin. Its roof was shingled with hand-split boards darkened by rain and years. Its chimney leaned slightly, but sent up a brave curl of wood smoke. Around it lay a clearing where stumps marked old felling, and beyond that, trees closed in again, oak and beech, pine and spruce, a green wall shifting with every breath of wind. The hunter who lived there was called Gerard by the few who knew him. Tall and spare, with a beard gone silver, he moved through woods as quietly as deer. Each autumn he filled the village larders with venison and wild boar. In winter he trapped fur for trade, but most days passed in calm solitude, his life bound to the forest's slow heartbeat. Morning began with fire. Gerard rose at first light, stirred the coals buried under ash, and set a pot to boil herbal tea and porridge. The cabin's single room was simple: bed of furs, shelves of dried herbs and smoked meat, bow and quiver hung neatly by the door. He ate slowly, listening to the waking forest, the cough of a stag, the scold of squirrels, the first low drumming of woodpeckers. After breakfast, he checked his gear, bowstring tested and waxed, arrows counted and fletched, knife whetted until it sang on stone. His dog, a quiet hound with wise eyes, watched every move. Then they slipped outside, boots crunching frost, and locked the door with a simple latch against curious animals rather than men. The day's hunt might be long or brief. Sometimes Gerard followed deer tracks deep into shadow, reading each bent grass and print in the mud. Other time he checked snays set along rabbit runs, freeing what he needed and resetting with care. He never took more than the forest could spare. Years had taught him the balance. The forest spoke in signs. Birds bursting upward warned of larger prey or predator. A faint musky scent told of boar nearby. The hush of small creatures meant wolves or bear might be close. Gerard read these without thought, moving with a slow, careful grace that kept him part of the woods rather than intruder. At midday he often paused to eat bread, dried meat, a flask of watered ale. He chose a fallen log or sunny rock, always watchful but at ease. His hound rested close, ears twitching even in sleep. Sometimes the hunter dozed briefly, waking at the least crack of twig. The forest's hum lulled but never deceived him. In autumn the work was hardest but richest. Deer fattened on fallen acorns, boar roamed bold. Gerard smoked meat in a small hut beside the cabin, its roof vented to let blue ribbons of fragrant smoke curl upward. The smell of oak and hickory hung sweet and sharp for weeks. Villagers came to trade grain, cloth, and salt for the winter's venison. Winter brought quiet hardship. Snow-blanketed paths, game grew scarce and wary. Gerard mended traps, kept the hearth bright, and lived on stored food. Some days he tracked fox or marten for their fur, selling pelts to passing merchants come spring. Nights were long but peaceful, fire crackling, hounds snoring softly, wind whispering through pines. Occasionally travelers knocked lost pilgrims, woodcutters delayed by storm, messengers seeking a short road. Gerard welcomed them with stew and fire, asked few questions, and saw them safely on their way. His cabin was known for miles as a quiet refuge, though no sign marked it. He kept a small shrine in one corner, a wooden cross carved by his own hands, a sprig of evergreen laid before it each Christmas. Though seldom among men, he prayed simply and often, finding God in the steady turn of seasons, the patience of trees, and the clear night sky. Spring softened the world again. Snowmelt trickled down from the hills. Deer shed winter coats. New shoots broke through leaf mold. Gerard walked the forest, checking which trails remained sound, repairing small bridges of logs where floods had torn them away. He planted herbs near the cabin, mint, sage, yarrow, for medicine and cooking alike. Summer was his quietest tie. Game ranged deep and scarce. He lived mostly on fish from the stream and the garden's bounty. The woods grew heavy with green, insects buzzing, air rich with pine and warm earth. On such days he carved spoons, bowls, handles for knives. Sometimes he hummed old songs remembered from youth, though no one was near to hear. Loneliness came, but gently. Gerard had chosen it and knew how to greet it, with work, with prayer, with the faithful presence of his hound. Now and then he visited the village for salt and trade, sharing ale with old friends, catching news of lords and wars. Yet he was always glad to turn homeward, back to the still trees and the soft clearing. Evenings in the cabin were simple. Meat hung smoking outside, herbs dried from the rafters. He read when he had a candle, or simply watched the fire until sleep pulled him down. Sometimes wolves howled far off, and the dog lifted its head but didn't bark. The cabin felt snug and safe. Rain drummed on the roof. Wind rattled the shutters. Inside, warmth and peace held steady. Years shaped a life as the forest shapes a tree, slowly with patience. Gerard aged but stayed strong. His cabin weathered storms and snow, but its hearth never went cold. Hunters passed, travelers rested, and still he walked each dawn with bow and dog, part of the same quiet rhythm. In a world of lords and wars, his story was small, yet in the hush of the deep woods it felt enough. A man, a dog, a steady fire, and the unending song of leaves and water. The hunter's cabin stood unseen by most, but it was a world entire for the one who called it home. Where the forest sinned and the fields began, a wide river wound its slow silver way. There was no bridge here, only a shallow ford where stones jutted through the current, and carts could sometimes pass if the water ran low. For generations, travelers had crossed at this place, timing their passage to weather and tide, trusting the solid feel of river stones underfoot. It was a quiet spot most days, marked by little more than the sigh of water and the cry of water birds. One late spring morning, the ford stirred with life. Mist still hung over the fields when a farmer named Hugh led his ox cart to the water's edge. He carried grain to the mill on the far side and wanted to cross before rains might swell the river. Behind him came two other villagers on foot, and farther down the path a merchant's wagon creaked slowly nearer, bells on the horse's harness tinkling softly. The river was cool and clear, running knee-deep over smooth stones. Fish darted in shadowed pools, reeds bent and whispered. Willows leaned low, their roots binding the bank. Birdsong filled the air, warblers in the thickets, a heron standing watch in the shallows. The smell was fresh and green, with a hint of mud where the current lapped. You paused to test the depth with a pole. Spring rains had been mild, the ford held safe. He led the oxen forward, slow and steady, wheels splashing, water curled around their knees, sunlight flashing on ripples. The cart rocked but did not stick. Soon it reached the far bank, and Hugh waved to those waiting behind. The two villagers followed, laughing softly as cool water soaked their boots. They helped steady a floating log that threatened to wedge under the merchant's wagon as it began to cross. The merchant himself, a careful man in a blue cloak, urged his horses slowly, calling to them with gentle words. The current tugged but did not overturn. Soon the heavy wagon rolled safe to shore. On the near bank a young girl watched, basket in hand. She had come to gather watercress and perhaps meet a friend from the other side. Her dog splashed joyfully in the shallows, sending up silver arcs. She waded after it, laughing, skirts tied high. The merchant smiled and tossed her a copper for luck, which she caught with delight. By mid-morning the ford grew busier. A small band of pilgrims arrived, staffs in hand, singing a low hymn as they approached. They removed sandals, tucked robes high, and crossed solemnly, pausing midstream to bless the water. Behind them rode a minor knight and squire, armor dulled by travel but still proud. The knight waited patiently for the pilgrims to finish, then guided his horse in with quiet confidence. Life gathered naturally here. A fisherman sat downstream, lines cast into deeper pools where trout lingered. Two boys tended geese grazing on the banks, tossing stones to chase away a stray fox. Women came to wash wool and linen, beating it against flat rocks, while gossip and laughter rose above the splash. Smoke from a small fire drifted where someone boiled pitch to mend a leaking boat. The river itself seemed gentle, yet everyone treated it with respect. Old stories told of sudden floods or travelers swept away when they rushed. A carved post marked the highest safe depth. If water rose past the notch, all waited. Children were warned never to play far from the shallows. The ford was generous, but not to be taken lightly. Toward noon, a tinker with pots and pans clanging arrived, followed by a shepherd driving a few shaggy sheep. The sheep balked at the water, bleating and scattering until the dogs dirted them firmly. Laughter rippled across the bank as they splashed through in a confused flock. The tinker waved cheerfully to all, his cart piled with shining wares. Sometimes strangers met here who might never cross paths elsewhere. Deals were struck, wool for grain, a pot for a loaf of bread, news for a drink. A passing minstrel sang for coins, perching on a willow stump. Travelers exchanged tales of roads ahead, where inns were friendly, where bandit lurked, where weather turned bad. The ford was a small hub of fellowship in a wide, scattered land. As afternoon waned, quiet returned. The fishermen packed up their lines, women lifted baskets of wet linen, and the last wagon creaked away down the far lane. Only ripples marked the day's crossings. Birds came back to the shallows, and a pair of deer stepped out to drink once the noise faded. The sun lowered, painting the river in bronze light. Toward dusk, a single traveler arrived, a weary peddler with pack and staff. He hesitated at the edge, judged the fading light, and stepped in slowly, lantern swinging. Midway across, he paused to look up. The sky was wide and flaming with sunset, and the river whispered around his boots. For a moment all was still but the soft rush of water and the quiet song of birds settling to roost. By nightfall the ford was empty again. Moonlight silvered every ripple, willows swayed gently in the cool breeze. Somewhere an owl called. The river went on with its ancient murmuring, carrying the day's footprints downstream and erasing them. Tomorrow it would wait for new travelers, farmers, pilgrims, merchants, children, all trusting the same stones beneath the same flowing water. In such places the world's bustle slows. People pause, help one another, share news, and move on. The ford knows they're passing, but asks no payment save care and patience. Year after year it bears their weight, a quiet witness to journeys great and small, in the wide hush of nature's own keeping. High above the lowlands, where fields give way to stone and the air turns sharp with pine and ice, a narrow pass winds between jagged peaks. Merchants and pilgrims use it in summer when the snows have retreated. Shepherds lead flocks across to greener valleys. Sometimes soldiers march its rocky floor. But most days it lies quiet and lonely, swept by wind, guarded by cliffs that catch the sky. At dawn the pass glowed pale and cold. Frost silvered the sparse grass. Every rock gleamed wet where meltwater had frozen in the night. A single mule train moved slowly upward, 3 animals laden with wool and salt, led by a trader named Renaud. His cloak was heavy, hood drawn tight, breath puffed white as he trudged. Behind him followed his nephew, a boy of 15, eager-eyed despite the chill. The way was no more than a track scratched into stone, wide enough for 1 cart at most. To the left, cliffs rose sheer. To the right, the land fell away into mist. Pine and larch clung where they could, their dark needles sighing in the wind. Somewhere far below, water roared unseen. Bells on the mules jingled softly, the only sound besides boots crunching frost. They passed an old wayside shrine, a weathered cross set into rock, candles long burned to stubs. Travelers for centuries had left tokens there, pebbles, coins, bits of ribbon, to seek safe passage. Renaud paused, touched the wood with gloved fingers, and murmured a prayer before moving on. The boy copied him solemnly, learning the silent ritual of the road. As the sun climbed, the mountains came alive with color. Snowfields glared white far above. Lower slopes blazed with autumn gold where larches turned, ravens wheeled and croaked, riding invisible currents. A marmot whistled sharp from a rocky perch. The boy grinned, but Renai only nodded. Beauty here was matched by danger. They reached the first true height by mid-morning. The path narrowed, twisting between sheer walls. Here old stones marked the border of two lordships, though no guard kept watch now. Once, long ago, tolls had been taken. Now the stones simply stood mossy and silent, carved with faint heraldic beasts. Wind hissed through the gap like breath through teeth. On the far side, the world opened in a breathtaking sweep, valleys rolling away to blue distance, snow on distant ridges gleaming like steel. The mules stopped of their own accord, ears flicking. Renaud and the boy stood a while gazing. Such sights humbled even seasoned travelers. The boy whispered a prayer without thinking. They pressed on carefully, for the descent was trickier than the climb. Loose shale shifted under boots, stones clattered down slopes. Renaud led the first mule with steady hand, speaking calm words. The boy kept the second's rope taut, learning the skill of guiding weight on treacherous ground. Far below, a faint thread of smoke marked a shepherd's hut, first sign of life they had seen since dawn. At midday they stopped at a small shelf where water trickled from rock into a trough carved long ago. Here they let the mules drink and fed them grain. They themselves ate bread and hard cheese, washing it down with cold water. Silence hung heavy but peaceful, broken only by the wind and the occasional clink of a mule's harness. Not all journeys here were so calm. Renaud told the boy old tales of avalanches burying caravans, of wolves bold in deep snow, of bandit once lurking before the lords cleared them out. The boy listened wide-eyed, glancing at every shadowed outcrop, but no danger showed itself today. Only the mountains, patient and vast, watched their passing. They moved again as clouds gathered. Weather changes swiftly in the heights. What begins as gentle mist can become driving snow. Renaud kept an eye on the peaks, knowing when to hurry. Soon the path dipped into a sheltered cleft, lined with dwarf pines, a place travelers often camped when storms threatened. There stood an old stone hut, roof patched but sound, built for just such refuge. Inside, it smelled of smoke and old wool. A hearth blackened with years of fire waited, and a small pile of wood remained from some generous soul. Renaud set about kindling a blaze, while the boy unpacked blankets. The mules, tethered safely outside, chewed hay and stamped quietly. Warmth spread slowly as flames took hold, painting the stone walls with soft gold. Outside, the wind rose, bringing thin sleet that rattled on the roof. They were glad for the hut's shelter. Renaud spoke softly of roadcraft, how to read snow lines, where to find springs, how to follow cairns when fog hides the path. The boy listened, soaking in wisdom older than maps. By dusk, the weather eased. They stepped outside to find clouds broken and the world awash in pink and silver. Peaks flamed briefly, then dimmed to blue shadow. A single star appeared, bright above the pass. The boy gasped, and even Renaud smiled, weary but moved. Such beauty was the quiet gift of hard roads. They slept in the hut, warm by the fire, mules shifting softly nearby. Outside the night was vast and cold, wolves howled far off, but the sturdy walls and the steady blaze kept fear at bay. Renaud prayed a short prayer of thanks for safe passage thus far and closed his eyes, trusting the mountain's patience. At dawn they rose again, breaking their fast quickly, and began the last leg down into the far valley. Mist burned away to reveal green slopes dotted with sheep and smoke from distant cottages. Bells from a chapel floated faintly up. The boy grinned in relief. Renaud's heart lightened too. Another crossing nearly done. Such is the mountain pass, harsh yet fair, demanding care but offering wonder. Travelers come and go, some fearful, some awed, all humbled by its vast quiet. Stone and wind remember every step, but give safe passage to those who move with patience and respect. On long winter nights, when wind swept the moors and woods groaned under its weight, people whispered of the wild hunt. They said that somewhere beyond the safe ring of fields and hearths, a ghostly cavalcade rode, hounds baying without breath, hooves striking sparks where none should be, horns blowing faint and hollow. Few claimed to have seen it, yet everyone knew someone who had heard it. A neighbor, a grandparent, a shepherd alone on the hills. This night the rumor stirred again in a quiet hamlet tucked near the edge of the forest. Snow lay deep, stars burned sharp and close. Inside the alehouse, men gathered around the hearth, mugs steaming, while outside wind prowled and rattled the shutters. A traveling peddler had arrived before dark, shaking frost from his cloak, and now his tale held the room silent. He spoke of riding the ridge road 2 nights past, moonless sky, frozen ground, at first only the wind and creak of trees, then a horn's distant call, low and mournful. His horse pricked ears, nostrils flaring. Soon he heard hooves, many and fast, though no road lay there. Hounds bayed, not with joy, but a hollow cry that raised his hair. He spurred on and dared not look back until lights of the next village broke the dark. Around the fire the villagers listened, faces flickering gold and shadow. Old Jory, who had tended sheep on the high moor for decades, nodded slowly. "I heard it once, long ago," he said. "Sounded like a storm coming fast, though the sky was clear. My dog tucked tail and would not move until it passed." Others murmured of kin and neighbors who had told the same. Yet outside the forest lay peaceful. Snow muted every sound. The brook ran black and slow. An owl hooted softly. Fox tracks stitched the white. The wild hunt, if it rode, was far away. Still the tale lingered, curling through the alehouse like smoke. Children edged closer to their mothers. Young men exchanged uneasy grins. Later, when the peddler had gone to bed in the loft and the last mugs were drained, a few stepped outside to check the night. Stars shone so bright it seemed they might fall. The air bit sharp and cold. No horn sounded, no hoof struck. Only the long sigh of wind across snowfields. Yet one could imagine riders hidden just beyond the trees, waiting. Back in their cottages, people banked fires and bolted doors a little tighter. Mothers told children to stay near hearth and light. Fathers checked that dogs were in and gates latched. It was not fear exactly, but respect same one felt for storms or deep rivers. Some left a scrap of bread on the sill or a sprig of holly by the door, small offerings against unseen riders. Near midnight, a shepherd returning late from checking his fold paused on the high path. He thought, just for a moment, that he heard something far off, a faint horn, the whisper of many hooves. Perhaps it was only the wind shifting through pines, but his dog pressed close and whined low. He hurried on, saying a prayer under his breath. Dawn came clear and cold. No tracks but fox and hare marked the snow. Yet the rumor lingered stronger than before, carried to the bakehouse, the smithy, the well. The wild hunt had been near, people said. Best to keep indoors when nights turned black and wind moaned. Best to honor the old ways. Thus the legend lived, half fear and half wonder in the quiet hearts of those who dwelt near wild places. Whether the hunt rode or not, it kept alive a sense of the forest's mystery, that beyond the fields lay a world older and stranger than man, where ghostly riders might yet thunder under the stars. Where the old cart track bent and vanished into deeper woods, there stood a small shrine. Moss crept up its stone base, and ivy curled around the wooden roof. A weathered figure of the Virgin looked down with calm eyes, her paint long faded, but her form still tender. No priest tended it. It belonged to travelers and woodland folk, kept alive by the quiet devotion of passing hands. Morning mist curled around the shrine as a woodcutter named Alan approached. His boots left dark prints in the dew. His axe rested across his shoulder. He paused before the little altar, removed his cap, and bowed his head. From his pouch he drew a small candle, beeswax and plain, and set it on the ledge. With flint and steel he coaxed a flame, shielding it from the damp until it caught and burned steady. The woods were silent but for the drip of dew and a far-off woodpecker's tap. Alan whispered a prayer for safe work and sound trees, for his wife's health and his children's laughter. He touched the cool stone, then went on, comforted by the simple ritual. Behind him the candle flickered softly in the pale light, smoke curling upward like a sigh. All day others might pass. A shepherd leading sheep to higher pastures stopped to leave a sprig of thyme. Two children gathering firewood knelt shyly and left a cluster of wildflowers. A traveling tinker, burdened with pots, touched the shrine lightly before vanishing down the track. No one lingered long, yet the place drew them, a pause in the forest's vast green. By midday, the light slanted warm and gold through beech leaves. Bees found the flowers left by children. A robin perched on the Virgin's hand, singing as if to keep her company. The scent of pine mixed with wax and moss. Though untended, the shrine felt alive, cared for by countless small gestures. A swept step, a repaired roof tile, a candle stub replaced by fresh. Sometimes the shrine bore signs of deeper sorrow. A strip of cloth tied for a sick child, a coin pressed into a crack for luck on a hard journey. Once a woman came alone, her eyes red, and left a little wooden toy before kneeling long in silence. No one asked her story. The woods kept such things gently. Evening came quietly. Shadows lengthened, the forest grew cool and fragrant. A hunter returning home paused to whisper thanks for a clean kill and safe passage. He poured a splash of wine at the base in offering, then vanished into the dusk. The candle from morning still burned, small but steady, casting a halo on the Virgin's face. At twilight, the shrine seemed almost to breathe. Fireflies sparked in the undergrowth. An owl called softly. The air felt hushed yet warm, as if the prayers whispered there lingered and joined the night's sounds. A last traveler hurried past, tipping his hat with no time to stop, but e'en he glanced toward the gentle glow. When full dark came, the candle guttered out at last, leaving a wisp of smoke. Stars glimmered through tree gaps, the Virgin watched in silence. Yet the memory of light and words hung about the little place. Tomorrow someone else would pass, bringing another flame, another flower, another quiet hope. Thus the forest shrine endured, lived grand, not rich, but beloved. In a world of long roads and uncertain fates, it stood as a small anchor of faith and comfort. Each traveler who paused left more than offerings. They left a piece of their worry behind, carried forward by the hush and the gentle gaze of the Virgin among the trees.